the poor till they are reach no more.
Here's the story about a little guy that lives in the blue world, working all day and all night, and everything he sees is just blue. Like him, inside and outside, blue his house with the blue little window and a blue road, and everything is blue.